Bien, je crois que nous allons pouvoir commencer cette séance introductive.
We are going to start this introductory session.
En présence de Basma Kodmani, qui est la directrice et fondatrice
of Basma Kodmani, who is the executive director and founder
l'Arab Reform Arab Reform Initiative,
Arab Reform
qui est
Initiative,
think tank, à ma connaissance,
which is the only French think tank, to my knowledge, completely devoted to the Arab world. And Gilles Kepel,
qu'on ne présente plus, qui était à l'Institut
doctor in sociology,
qui a écrit de nombreux ouvrages,
he wrote many
celle de sa carrière au
books
monde
and
arabe.
devoted most of his career to the
Nous
Arab
allons
world.
essayer de faire un peu un panorama de la situation actuelle.
Take an overview of the current situation.
Une situation qui peut apparaître assez sombre.
Going further than the quite dark situation we're in, which does not necessarily make us think of renewal as something quite obvious or easy. We're going to look at what are the current deep changes that are underway, despite this tragedy that
en 2011, le monde arabe est entré en révolution.
In 2011, the Arab world underwent a revolution, or rather several revolutions, because these revolutions were so different from one country to another. And these revolutions, these upheavals that we very soon, maybe too soon, called the Arab Spring, led to various processes, sometimes chaotic and violent processes, that sometimes took us back, sometimes brought about armed conflicts.
Des transitions, comme en Tunisie,
but that also, in some cases, led to transitions, such as in Tunisia, which is quite a remarkable exception right now. It seems to be a real success, and maybe it will be a model for the rest of the Arab world, but also further than the Arab world as well, maybe in the success of this democratic transition. What we are seeing today are states that are weakening, boundaries that are disappearing, radical movements which are appearing, tribal movements that are gathering strength,
transcende d'anciennes frontières, des haines confessionnelles qui se déchaînent
overcome some boundaries,
de part et d'autre de la Méditerranée,
faith hatreds that are
donne lieu à des
appearing on both sides of the
dont les
Mediterranean,
sociétés sont les
and that
premières
leads
à
to
subir les effets.
tragic violence,
voit, en tout cas dans les médias,
which has a significant impact on societies. This is what we see in the media, and I'm in a good position to see this. This is something that we work on a daily basis at the Monde newspaper I work for.
Du tragique,
but apart from this spectacular aspect, the tragic aspect, what we are trying to tell about are the longer-term and in-depth processes that are leading to changes that sometimes trigger these events, these violent events. I feel that the more the stronger the violence, the more significant the radicalization is, the more it means that the changes are happening in depth and are being resisted by the older orders, because this kind of change cannot happen easily. So these violent events that we can see throughout the Arab world today may be symptoms of resistance to change. And the bigger the change, the more resistance it brings about.
L'irruption de la jeunesse comme
I see four main elements. The involvement of youth as a driver in society. For a very long time, young people were submitted to their elders. And as was said this morning, 60% of the 400 million inhabitants of the Arab world are under the age of 25. I think that today societies are aware of this and that these young people have taken up the words, but are also in some cases the arms, and that they can no longer be stopped. In societies where information was always very limited and under control, information flows much more freely through satellite chains, through the internet. There are no longer isolated islands in the Arab world. There are no inhabitants who are not aware of what's going on in real time. That's a major change, a major element of the past 10 years. A third important change, I feel, is that religion is becoming more and more private. Each individual lives his religion in a very private way, which creates tensions in societies where some people want to impose their own way of being religious to others. I think that this the religion aspect is becoming more personal, not always necessarily private. Though. This is something I was able to see in Egypt in the past 3 years. And last important thing or change is that women have become more and more important in social functions. They are asking for their voice to be heard in a very public way, and this is a major change in the social order. The social order that existed up until now in the Arab world, and of course this triggers tensions and problems. We will talk about this, I guess, during this introductory roundtable. But before this, Gilles Kepel is going to give us an overview, like he is used to doing, which can summarize the current situation of the Arab world while taking into account the history. And then Bassa Kodmani will maybe tell us a bit more specifically about the articulation between these three players, i.e. the state, the religion, and society, because there is this new player, new stakeholder, which is society. So it's a new game with three players. Maybe it's a bit more upset, but also more open than until now. So Gilles.
Merci beaucoup, Christophe, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Christophe, Mr. President, Mr. Minister,
peut-être est-ce que c'est l'amitié qui, en ces
Your
jours
Excellencies,
tragiques,
ladies and gentlemen,
vers laquelle
maybe it is because it is so topical today. I would like to thank you for inviting us, Basma Kodmani, Christophe and myself, to present this introductory roundtable. It is introductory, but it comes after the very strong words of the President of the Institute, Jacques Lang, and of the President of the French Republic. I believe that in the current period, the time for reflection, the time for putting things into perspective is very important. You fully realized that this is what the President of the Republic did this morning, but I think we can try to go further in this way, because when you are faced with cultural, economic, political challenges such as we are today, the articulation between the political sphere, and we had to the top on that sphere with the President Hollande's
société civile,
speech,
dont Basma
and
Godmani
with the civil society, represented by Basma Godmani. Basma Godmani is a very important player of the civil society with the forum she founded and the role that she played at the beginning of the Syrian revolution with a very strong involvement. She will probably be telling us about, and myself as an academic as well. I think that it is through this dialogue that we can build answers, reflections, and an understanding of what is going on. Because the world we are living in, which is the world of social networks on information, TV chains, but also the world of newspapers and books, proof is the current polemics on the caricatures and representation of the prophet. Great number of young people in France believe that since Islam was founded, that it was forbidden, has been forbidden to show the prophet. All those who have looked at this know that it is wrong. You can see a representation of the prophet in Ayatollah Khomeini's office.
Mais dans la miniature ancienne,
in ancient miniatures, there are picture representations
vous avez des représentations du prophète
of the prophet, and you can find these in many museums of the world.
À l'époque contemporaine. Donc tout cela indique quoi? Indique
what does all this tell us?
Un grand nombre de nos débats contemporains
It shows that a number of our debates are very immediate and do not take into account the civilization and the history. And, the presidents, both presidents, the President of the Republic and the President of the IMA, reminded us that the issue of education, the issue of taking into account what cultural traditions are and how they interact is a major challenge when faced with the information we receive from the networks today, that there seems to be a clash of civilizations between two closed groups who would be completely opposed. The truth of society is not there, it is in interactions, some of which may end in conflict, but I think it is our work to try and convey this. So this trilogue, if I may say, between politicians this morning, civil society and academics is something very important. And it's important for this to happen at the Institute of the Arab World here in Paris, which since the renewal of the Institute here has become very important. I would like to thank Jacques Lang and his teams for their role in this process. And the Institute of the Arab World is playing this essential role, and I hope that in the future years they will keep playing this role, and maybe with more interactions with the universities, and it could very well become a bridge with French society, with all of its components. So a bridge between French society and the world of knowledge. So I'm very happy that in a way a new era is happening at the Institute of the Arab World with your current initiatives.
Je vois ça derrière mon dos. Dans l'écran, vous voyez ça sur le calico qui est ici.
You can see.
Je vois davantage la caméra.
Can you please focus the camera a little bit more so that I can see better?
Je vois que derrière moi,
so I see that behind me,
il y a renouveau du monde arabe en
it says renouveau du monde arabe in French and Arab World Renewal in English. There's something missing. Why isn't it written in Arab? So which word should we pick in Arabic.
Un tuyau tout à l'heure. Il faut d'ailleurs que je précise.
I asked Basma a little bit
Christophe
earlier.
m'a assigné dans le rôle terrifiant de professeur de Sciences Po pour l'éternité, chargé de faire un panorama.
Christophe said that I was in charge of presenting an overview as a Sciences Po professor, but this panel is also a family panel because Basma and myself both were students at Sciences Po, and I'm not going to tell you when it was. Basma was much younger than I was, and Christophe was then my student at Sciences Po.
Les deux seuls étudiants politistes qui allions au cours d'arabe à Sciences Po. Les autres étaient des camarades libanais qui étaient en section économique et financière, mais qui faisaient de l'arabe pour avoir des points en plus. Nous étions les deux seuls à étudier des textes politiques en arabe à l'époque, X années.
And that was a number of years ago, and we're now still talking about this. So I was asking Basma how we should say this in Arabic. Because if there's a renewal in the Arab world, maybe it would be interesting to know how Arabs say it in a world in a language that is their common language, and the Institute of the Arab World is here to remind us of this, because I know that it now has ambitious teaching programs for Arabic.
Dans notre enseignement secondaire,
major problem in schools in France, and I think the minister is thinking about this. I would like to say hello to the Moroccan Minister of Education who could maybe help us in this. So should we say Nahda? Nahda is the word that the President of the Republic used. It's a word that is usually translated into French by Renaissance. And that was used in the Arab world to talk about the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, which mostly focuses on the Levant area, which is now where all conflicts are happening, because the civil war in Syria is happening after the war in Iraq and the war in Lebanon. And what made Nahda so important was the diversity of components in the Arab society. It was a society in which Sunnite, Shiites, Jews and Christians had been able to build, and this is what led about the Nahda. They had managed to build a way of living together in society that went further than the frameworks set by the religious authorities. So the Nahda was saying this, and at the time, this part of the Arab world was under the Ottoman authority. And they used the Nahda as well. It was a way to distantiate themselves from this osmosis between religion and politics. This is what the Nahda was trying to do. You know this pluralism in the Levant seems to have turned into the contrary of what it was. It was very painful on Lebanon at the end of the 20th century. Iraq followed suit, and now it is the turn of Syria. Even though the fault lines are not exactly the same, and alliances are being made and broken. So that's the first element. How could this component of enrichment, of creation of a new civilization, taking into account pluralism, how could this have turned
de communautés structurées sur une identité très largement fantasmée, nourrie de pseudo-pensées instantanées qui vient à partir des réseaux sociaux où tel ou tel s'autoproclame imam en chef.
Where anyone
can stick to celui qui maîtrise le mieux le ilm, la théologie. Et quel est le processus qui s'est produit et comment faire en sorte pour que justement on essaye de retrouver et selon quelle modalité la logique du renouveau. Alors, il y a une autre manière de dire renouveau, il y en a beaucoup.
Other words to say renewal. There's one that no one wants to use today, which is Ba'ath,
qui a été dévoyé par le baasisme. Jacques Berck,
too much used by
avait traduit le terme Ba'ath en français par surrection. Résurrection.
Berck had translated Ba'ath by surrection, like resurrection, but just
on a vu malheureusement ce que cette surrection ou cette résurrection a donné, puisque le baathisme qui s'était construit sur la volonté de faire émerger un nationalisme arabe fort, une sorte d'oumma arabe,
Arab nationalism,
à des situations d'oppression
led to terrible oppression.
Il y a aussi un autre terme qu'on pourrait utiliser.
There's another word we could use, which is
qui signifie effectivement le renouveau, la
revivification,
pour le traduire plus exactement, a surtout eu une carrière, pas exclusivement, mais dans le domaine religieux.
Mostly had a career in the religious world.
Connaît le titre du célèbre ouvrage la revivification des sciences religieuses, la revivification de la théologie. Et justement, il semble qu'une partie de ce qu'on voudrait appeler ce renouveau se déroule, ou en tout cas a pour objet, qu'il soit explicite ou qu'il soit scellé, la question du religieux.
Has the religious question in mind.
La dimension accrue de la privatisation de la religion
talked about how religion was becoming more and more private in Arab society today. Those who only look at information networks and do not read newspapers would say that you are crazy because what just happened is proving the contrary. Religion has invaded the public sphere. The killers at Charlie Hebdo involved religion by shouting Allah Akbar. Koulibaly
pour essayer de prendre leur part de marché dans le business des otages et de son financement. Tout cela semble indiquer complètement le contraire.
Involvement, all this seems to show quite the contrary. That today we are more in publicizing the religious aspect, which is involved in all parts of public life.
Mais en fait, vous avez raison.
But in fact, you're right.
À mon sens, en tout cas.
Well, I think you're right. You know, once a professor, always a professor. But didn't it give you good grades in the past?
Et donc, qu'est-ce qui se passe? C'est que,
so what's happening
en réalité, me semble-t-il, en tout cas, mais c'est un objet dont bien sûr on peut débattre tout à l'heure.
But of course, we could have a discussion
il y a aujourd'hui, en dépit de ce qui semble être cette espèce de chapeau de plomb salafiste qui s'est abattu sur la pluralité de la pensée
religieuse thinking
je pense à ça en particulier,
Muslim world.
Après de nombreuses visites que j'ai faites dans les 3 pays d'Afrique du Nord au cours du trimestre écoulé et où
in the past few months I got to meet religious authorities in Morocco, in Algeria,
le ministre des Habous,
in which the minister of Habous, Mr. Hamed Tagoufik, and his Algerian colleague Mohamed Aissa.
L'un et l'autre ont insisté sur le fait que dans les pays
stress the fact that in Maghreb,
la France,
countries, which are key countries when it comes to the definition that France gives of the religious facts, as most French people, most Muslim cultures, individuals who live in France, most of them come from the Maghreb countries. So these two ministers and many of their colleagues did emphasize the fact that with the growth of a social network, the development of a social networks, we see, in fact, a leavening off or leavening out, as it were, of the religious cultures that had been erected in North Africa. And whether you use Malikism as a standpoint or other viewpoints, Hanafisms could be one of them. Hanafisms of the Janissaries and the Turks in Algeria and Tunisia. But all this has been leveled off due to the action of the bulldozer of the Salafis, non-thinking and the repetition and constant repetition of the dogma, so annihilation of thinking. And Twitter played a part there. 146 signs is all you needed to state the norm, the standard, without relating it to the past history, its origin. One of the first tasks of this movement, whether we call it Nada, of course not Bas, but Ilaya, maybe, you could refer to it as a Tajdid, the fact that you want to build something new from the old by using the various forms of the old system. You see here again, it's the E pluribus unum motto that comes to mind, something that enables us to constitute a society living together as members of the Arab world, but living together and being together as part of those global networks of which we've become a part. As they like to say, when people get married, they don't get married anymore for the worse, for the better, and for worse. North African states, European Union states, Africa do make up what we call the civilization axis as well as the cohabitation axis. Because there are many Northern African people, natives from Northern Africa living in Europe, but also because after independence, we see this increasing trend, a number of flows, and they've come here and they're here to stay. But it's not limited to Western Mediterranean or the Holy Holies mentioned by François Hollande earlier on, because it's what's at stake here is very different. It's something that concerns the domestic situation. But the Middle East
dans la mesure où les échanges économiques et les échanges culturels
is keen to encourage economic exchanges and other types of exchanges with France. So perhaps we should try and build this new set of this new system and do it at the same pace and try not to use war weapons, Kalashnikovs, or send plant bombs or drop bombs on one another. So, where do we come from? Referring to recent history, as the President of the French Republic just said, starting December 2010, probably, with a dramatic attack by Mohamed Bouazizi, who in Sidi Bouzid in its rural suburbs, the hinterland of the capital city, set fire to himself to protest against Hogra. That's the kind of social, cultural feeling that he had. Seeing the police
jusqu'à la situation actuelle, on a donc l'émergence à ce moment-là où on pense qu'émerge sur la scène politique.
And that's probably the time when they see that a new class of actors was coming to the forefront. Someone said earlier, I think Christophe said, there are no islands anymore. In other words, what's happening in the Arab world is bound to make an impact outside of that part of the world. You're referring to the recent events, the mingling, the interpretation of videos, barbaric acts perpetrated by Daesh in Syria, and the recent events in France at the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo, Boulevard Charles Lenoir, where a policeman who was executed, was shot by the Kouachi brothers as being an apostate, or again what happened at the Kosher hyper supermarket. All this is commingled. In other words, the world of social networks, tweets and Facebooks, it has erased both time and space. In spite of this feeling of omnipotence, that is, in fact, it's a trap, because it doesn't give you any key to understand why such acts are committed. As evidence of this, I'd like to explain what we perceived of the Arab world events around 2012-2013. First of all, some people said that the specificity, the features of the Arab world governed by authoritarian regimes and doomed, apparently doomed to the expression of religious radicalism, jihadism, Salafism were the only alternatives there. And some said, no, that's the end of it. Those who took to the street, Avenue Bourguiba, Place Tahrir, or again, place of the third in Manama, although it's more complicated, organize these events, these marches, and protests and demonstrations in Damas after prayer. They were exactly like us. We had achieved this. No need to look into cultural traditions of that universe, because as a matter of fact, they end up being exactly like us. Being on Twitter, remember the girls or the boys speaking French or English on Tahrir Square. So that's the end of Ben Laden, jihad, because the Arab world is exactly as we are. At long last, they've entered civilization. In fact, as you know, we are the victims of two transmissible diseases, intellectual diseases that come from the USA. Huntington knows, and Fukuyama knows. In other words, we're all the same. Republican Democratic parties are exactly the same everywhere, and mankind is bound to be happy at last. So that was Fukuyama. And then things started to appear a bit more complicated with the Muslim Brothers, and then the deterioration of the situation, Syria being the most striking example of this deterioration, but then Bahrain was a foresight of this, because we are in an oil-rich country, and then people switched to hang to their noses, saying a clash of civilization, it's hopeless. They'll end up, they're nothing, they're really retarded. As a people, let's erect borders and frontiers, let's protect ourselves, as they used to say in Egypt at the time, that's it, we've had it, there's nothing to be done. So this is Sulla and Charybdis. Where are we to find a position for ourselves between these two extremes? And this is where thinking comes in. The role of academia is a key one. So in 2010 to 13, what they call the Arab revolutions, implies that one looks at the horizontal dimension that Christophe referred to, the contagion, contamination, contagious effect, the fact that the global information network being where they are. We live in one world, but then there is a vertical dimension referring to the past, the Torah in Arabic. What we have inherited, it's a difficult word to translate, is more than tradition. It's too sclerotic a word. I'd rather say everything that we have inheriting and that we are using and working on. So we have to manage and use both at the same time. And this was not the case. Fukuyamaitis is the world is flat. Huntington knows this. Each one of us belongs in a silo, a frozen civilization, the silo approach. Well, of course, the truth must be somewhere in between. But the voices that encourage this middle-of-the-road approach can hardly be heard because people want oversimplification. It gives them the feeling somehow that at least for the short term, they produce much more benefits. It's more effective, and there were a number of sources of apprentices that financed and sponsored radical movements, thinking they would be able to defeat their enemy on sight. But these people are the victim of a backlash, whereby they too are bitten by the snake they were harboring in their own bosom. So I think this is important to realize. With the recent collapse of the Syrian state and to a large extent in Iraq as well, a number of structural elements erected a century ago. I wouldn't hate to use the word celebrate or commemorate, but it's going to be the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That's at the end of the Ottoman Empire, the completion of the map of the Levant and the joint aegis of Great Britain with Sykes, Secretary of Foreign Office Secretary, and Georges Picot for France, Foreign Minister of France at the time. So Sykes-Picot divided the Middle East in so many states, whose legitimacy was denied by many in order to achieve a proper political balance where minorities will enjoy some spaces where they could exert a major political influence. Of course, this is an oversimplification. The Sykes-Picot Agreement led to the creation of a number of states that were pretty stable, and of course civil societies were being repressed or suppressed, freedoms and liberties disappeared. But all this is being erased. Daesh, the Islamist right question, in other words, the Islamic State in Iraq and in the Levant, the first thing they did was to kind of erase, using an eraser, a rampa between the border between Iraq and Syria. It's the one single urban space, kind of a Sunnistan that has been built up from scratch. So, disappearance of traditional frontiers and all the traditional landmarks have disappeared, and new signs, new landmarks must be set up, new points of reference. Now, how can we build new points of reference? There are two possibilities. Either getting rid of cultural points of reference and landmarks using morbid slogans with the counter reaction that this triggers. Abu Samsuri, an engineer from Aleppo, who was educated in France. In 2004, this person advocated a vision of the world with a main battlefield in Europe, where he would create provocations and multiply challenges that was 10 years ahead of his time, so that the Muslim European population of Muslim origin would fight one another. They'd be taken hostages by networks, and those of you who take taxis or cabs, depending on the origin of the driver, know that this is the case. You can hear about the two visions of the world being expressed by taxi drivers, not just by taxi drivers, but by taxi drivers. So this is one approach. We might think, we could say that this is a renewal, but even worse, that the Ba'athist renewal. It's really scary. Now, on the other hand, the other temptation is status quo. It happened before, right after September 11. Authoritarian states survived the attack of the Twin Towers. Ben Ali is better than Ben Laden. But the outcome was not good. Okay, jihad radicalism is rampant, but it doesn't mean that we have to strengthen authoritarian structures, because some of these structures feed this thrive of these radical movements that they either finance or sponsor. The present republic referred to the perfect symmetry between Bashar al-Assad's state on the one hand and Daesh on the others. The two go hand-to-hand together in order to inoculate jihadism in the population, and that's how Syria has imploded. I may not be a good guy, but the other one is even worse than I am. So this is where we have something to say. We have to step in here in this dialogue. We have to play our part. And our role, of course, punishing or policing this situation in this world is something that we can do, but we can do so much more and better than this at IMA. What we should do is make sure that we better articulate the thinking over the transformation of the Arab world, and make sure that it goes hand in hand with the state action, or even the action of the elites, the associations, the media. So this is the real challenge ahead of us. Let me call it a civilizational challenge.
l'objet d'un certain nombre
I'm
de
sure
tables
that a number of roundtables which are going to take place during these 2 days will delve into this issue, but it's an absolute must. The studies on the Arab world is appalling in France. Nobody can study the Arab world anymore. I've just completed, and that was on request of the Prime Minister, I've just completed the report. Now, in the past 8 months, traveling with Mr. Cousran, Ambassador Cousran, I've been drafting a report. I met many of you in the Middle East, in France, in other countries too, and I'd like to try and see whether we can take on board these new demands on the academia. We needed to get more from university people so that we are better enlightened, better guided when it comes to conducting a political action. And of course, we need to educate the media, but that would be a huge task for us.
C'est un véritable enjeu.
So this is the challenge ahead of us, I would say. I think there's only one university professor in France who is a specialist in northern Africa. Rashid, this is for you. Iranian studies have disappeared from academia in France. This is baffling. Now, when it comes to the teaching of Arabic as a language, it's a sheer disaster for many different reasons. First of all, because some president universities or even schools, headmasters don't want to teach Arabic or don't want Arabic to be taught in their schools. It would send the wrong message. That's what they think. Then you have religious organizations that tell the parents they shouldn't send their children to our schools where they teach Arabic. And also because Arabic programs, you have to pay for those. Of course, it makes a very good source of income for the individuals who teach Arabic. We shouldn't allow this to happen. Arabic, as a language, is a rich civilization tool. And suppose, if indeed the school is not in position to convey the message, to send it across, that is, consider that Arabic as a language is the carrier as a civilization, that Russian, Spanish, English, what have you, then of course we are caught in this trap that radical Islamists would like to see us jump into. So it's a very tricky challenge, but I remain convinced that there's a will call for the renewal, and this is why I accept I'd be very pleased when I hand over the report on this topic to the Prime Minister. I'll be listening to my colleagues with great attention. I think that all of us share a common purpose, a common objective. And this is what I got from the President of the French Republic's message this morning. Now, there are huge challenges ahead of us. Let's try to step back, put things in perspective. It's no luxury. It's not something that a pipe dream. It's something that we must absolutely do. And this will be my concluding word. I promised Christophe I'd be brief, but as he rightly knows, professors know that they're not bound by their own promises. Thank you, Gilles.
Pour cet exposé brillant.
Thank you. This is very enlightening. Asma,
le Centre pour l'initiative arabe.
You work, the Center for the Arab Initiatives was created in order to work on the emergence of civil societies. So that was before the Arab revolutions. And then they took place. and you were well equipped to deal with the situation. Maybe we were over-optimistic. At the time, we thought that everybody back there, in your countries, were exactly the same determination as you had. Maybe these people are still somewhere in the background. They haven't totally disappeared, be it in Egypt, where their situation is difficult, or in Syria, where again arms and weapons speak louder than the words of agony. Anyway, these civil societies are still mobilized against the state, against religious power, against what they consider to be an oppression, be it immoral, religious, or government oppression. And still, are they still active? Are they still there? What about the relation between the civil society, state, and religious authorities? Thank you. It's I'd like to catch up somewhat and be as brief as possible. In other words, thank you to Gilles for saying so much. He's said most of it. What I wanted to say about the situation. Of course, you need to establish a diagnosis. You have to call on academia, scientists, and ask them to come up with the roadmap. The last week's events in France obliges us all, Democrats of Arab origin, to say that this is probably the largest demonstration in this country since the Second World War, or the First World War, sorry. And what was that? Were to oppose, to protest the acts perpetrated by three dumb people who claim to act in the name of Islam. I'm sure that something must be done. It's going to be a long-lasting task. It's in-depth thinking on education, on secular tenets, what can be represented in what we call the public space, but basically, I would say that this question can be tackled, can be solved, because this is what most actors want. We live in a democracy in France. A government has asked specialists to submit a report. There'll be recommendations made, and the government will take the conclusion of this report into account. There's going to be a true reflection of what's at stake. Now, the real battle, the struggle, should be fought on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. For the past 3 years, there's been a discussion, and it all started even before the Arab revolutions. Some discussions were organized between different political parties, but this debate was becoming extremely tense whenever freedom of expression was at stake. So freedom of expression, as well as the place or the role of religion in public institutions, in the public space and in government. And this is we're feeling the impact, we're bearing the brunt of these two debate, these two oppositions. I think the role of religion in society and in the state institutions in the very definition of a state. So we can't rely on discourses and sharing of ideas. Of course, it has to start with a clear definition of concept. I've been observing the situation for the past 4 years attentively, and I see that concepts here and there are becoming quite clear, especially in Tunisia. Much more so than in the civil society of Egypt, for instance, or even in Syria, maybe also in Yemen. But in any case, in Tunisia, the concept has always been very clear. And of course, we are influenced by what's happening in France. We follow the same approaches. So that's the need to use clear-cut concepts. But of course, this battle is a political, essentially. The battle, the struggle on the other side of the Mediterranean is extremely fierce. This battle or this debate couldn't be an open one. It was repressed. And we need to be specific when we take stock of the heritage that civil societies, in the Arab world in particular, that took to the streets, that expressed their views and took position, is a very important one. One has to go back 40 or even 50 years ago, the Sadat area in Egypt. But this is a familiar pattern, i.e. the political power, the political powers needed a second actor to coping. That's religion, those that represent religion or Islam, those who can state ethics, say what order is, not just orders as in law and order, emergency, urgency laws, martial law, very useful if you want to close up the public space. But letting the religious authorities manage public space at all levels. And this is the heritage, this is what we're seeing. Even in France, this is the heritage, or the legacy, rather, of this trend. These two institutions, that political authorities and religious authorities, have been managing the situation as a duet. This was kind of condominium. Some would manage or control a closed open space, a secured space, and the rest, or the others, were controlling hearts and minds. And this second actor has become so important that it has grown into a real monster, a religious institution with the representative of political Islam, representative of Islam. It's not political Islam yet, but it is social, cultural Islam, of course, religious Islam. So these people, they never made any political claim, and they're free to grow, and they're impacted, invested. The media, social media, the issue of women has been contaminated, and not just wearing the veil, but the personal status code, which is, it hasn't changed, and the black letter of the law hasn't changed, but the application, the implementation of the law has changed. And this has become the monopoly of those who represent the religious institutions. Sometimes this religious institution is important, as are in Egypt, a Wahhabite institution in Saudi Arabia, but the same phenomenon is present everywhere. And the political power has decided, gave up on challenging the religious authorities, and now we have this rampant discourse, totalitarian discourse, intellectually totalitarian discourse based on censorship in the name of moral and a certain interpretation of Islam. So clearly, this is a political approach, political transformation of Arab societies. So, what are the actors that can change the deal? Well, in Tunisia, when for the first time, civil society, the society, via political parties, reached a historical consensus between Islamist as opposed to democratic or secular parties. They've reached some kind of consensus, and this is reflected in two articles of the Tunisian constitution that give a wide, an open definition of the relationship between state and religion. But this is the only country that was able to give this redefinition that could meet the Democrats' demands. Once this is written, the Constitution, all remains to be done is implement the text, and we lack actors. There are many Democrats in the Arab world. At the time of the murder, the Charlie Hebdo's murder, and the hyper-kosher supermarket, Democrats did see that the fault line was not so much between Muslims of French origin as opposed to non-Muslim people. The issue was not an issue of identity. But okay, we need maybe a new identity, but then the identity that prevailed was not the Muslim one, it was the democratic identity. I'd be tempted to say I'm Syrian, a Democrat. I'd rather say I'm a Democrat Syrian. I'm a Democrat. I happen to have a Muslim cultural identity, but I'm essentially a Democrat. I'm a Democrat by essence. Many of us are Democrats. Are we organized? The answer is no, we're not. So this inability on our part to put our act together and get organized is not an endemic problem. It's just because we haven't had the time to get organized. So I would say that we see many authoritarian responses to the challenge of Islam. It's the Sisi formula in Egypt. We must repress, we must suppress. And Democrats themselves recognize, acknowledge that this is a huge failure, a very painful failure for them. They accepted Sisi, in other words, repression by them, and the return to an order which is even more authoritarian than the Mubarak's one. Sisi, and this is different, fights against everything that appears to be extremist and radical, from the worst extremists to the most moderate ones. In other words, we've lost. In the middle, we've lost out some of the forces that could lead the way towards more moderation. A candidate that left the Muslim Brothers to stand as independent candidate in the presidential elections, and then set up his own political party. But the climate, the situation is not ripe for this type of organization. We see that Democrats are fighting everywhere, but they are in a very weak position in armed conflicts. I'm referring to Syria in particular. One sees that the Democrats that protested peacefully to begin with were faced with a fierce repression by the regime, and have left. Others took up arms. Many of them wanted to come to France. France was the place to go. And most of them decided to come to France rather than to other European countries.
But those who stayed, who decided to take up the arms for a democratic fight, maybe it seems contradictory, but it really is not. The history shows that Democrats sometimes have to take up arms. These strengths are in a minority because they are being overcome and also infected. Gilles Capet was using the word of inoculating jihad and extremism in the Syrian opposition. It is true that this current has taken up a lot of space and has a lot of strength, and democratic forces have become very reduced. It's obvious that in a military struggle, and as opposed to the regime that is not sparing them at all, and faced with the extremists, the most extremists today being Daesh. So these forces are really in a minority, and they are looking for a way to express themselves. And this is why they are looking for a way to speak up. This is why they are looking at the international criminal court, because this is how they think they can make a comeback. But everywhere in societies where there's no armed conflict, the Democrats are not organized. So in this battle, in this struggle, it's not just going to be about ideas. We have to have towards structures that present these ideas, but also implement them. We can all write 50 articles and hundreds of books on the need to reform Islam and on what democratic thinking is. But it is not through individual books and works that we can make it. Our main challenge is this. It is the challenge of setting up cultural structures and institutions, educational institutions, training of professors in the Arab world, because it is not only by training imams in France that will be able to reform French Islam and create an Islam for France. It is indeed urgent, but it is also by removing on the other side of the Mediterranean these references that are poisoning the debate in France. A Democrat who lives in France today cannot sleep because of his country of origin. And this is what we have to underline. And we have to make a choice for those who are in the middle on both sides of the Mediterranean, which is my case. I believe that the actors of change and reform in France are present. They exist and they can act. I feel it is more important and more urgent to work on the other side of the Mediterranean, in Arab societies, in setting up these institutions. We need institutions holding the ideas. We need political organizations. We need network organizations. It's a real challenge to organize the democratic forces, and I believe this is at the core of what needs to be done so that the Democrats can become true players. Demonstrating in France, 1.5 million people demonstrating in France, 3.5 million people throughout France. Those are hundreds of civil society associations, organizations, the media, who are able to trigger such an event with such a strong message, and they can keep conveying, passing on this message in different ways. We do not have such structures to do this in the Arab world. Right now, we are spread out. Democratic forces have not gotten together yet. there's a crisis in legitimacy that comes from their financial resources, their funding. There's no question of legitimacy for religious organizations, because when you are funded by a Muslim state, it is completely natural. We're all Muslims, and so Muslim money will come from such or such country or such religious institution that has a lot of wealth, and this will seem very natural. There's no issue of legitimacy. But for Democrats who do not want these sources of funding, there's a real issue of funding. What means do they have? In a forum such as the one we have today, when we're talking about renewals, when we are wondering about who the players are and which coalitions have to be set up, there will be in this forum important debates among entrepreneurs, and the private sector approach is an essential approach in this process. The private sector is a natural partner. It is not always an innocent partner. It has its own agenda, of course, its goals and its ambitions. Nevertheless, with the interest, alliances and coalitions can be set up. And this private sector, local private sectors, have a very significant role to play to back media initiatives and the creation of these institutions that are presenting these democratic ideas. This is not utopia. I am truly saying that we have a social democrat current. Let's call it Muslim Democrats, that is there. And all these currents agree on democratic values. The main battlefield are freedom and the state, freedom of speech and expression of diversity. We have to go against political powers that handle in an irresponsible way the diversity of society, that made the governance and institutions, the army and security services, police services, religious. The most extreme example may be that of Syria. In the name of secularism, it created religious militia. In the name of secularism, you have to be very cautious around this speech around secularism, which is being used by the different regimes. I would not put in the same bag the regime of Assad and the regime of Egypt with the army that is repressing in order to govern. However, the issue of the governance of diversity is an absolutely vital criterion for the protection of minorities, the protection of equality and the beginning of equality and citizenship. Those who are seeing the Yazidi, the Christians, or the Kurds being threatened, rather than trying to protect minorities, those should hold the regimes accountable for the management of the plurality in societies. It's difficult to say that we're Arabs because our society is also Kurd. So this description is a problem because our society, the reality of our society is different. The only possible identity is that of democracy. And the Democrats, we are losing, you are losing them as people to talk to on the other side of the Mediterranean. It really is a battle in which we have to take major risks. We cannot only go against extremism together, because individually we are exposed to risks, true risks. Sometimes risks for our lives, but risks that also make people fear or feel less legitimate because of moral speech that deprives us of the democratic speech.
Cet ingrédient, cette marchandise
exploitée, this raw material used in our countries is something we see on a daily basis, which is why many French citizens and French residents of Arab origins took to the streets last Sunday. They were there to say that, yes, there is national unity and we are part of this national unity. There's a message of freedom, and we are part of this. They had a lot of reservations on the opportunity or decency of what was presented in these drawings. But we were not talking about freedom of speech at the time. We were talking about the right to life. And I'm waiting for this moment for the religious to declare a fatwa against anyone who would try to kill anyone. Those who condemned the Charlie Hebdo drawings at the time they were published, those same ones should say that we are suffering enough, that there should not be an attempt at taking the life of anyone. There have been enough victims. When you're from Syria or Libya, we know the value of this struggle. And in the face of this, I think it is necessary to collectively go against this intimidating speech that sometimes leads to legitimating violence. There's an incitation to hatred in our region. It has happened for too long a time. Authoritarian regimes have been doing this, and civil societies are not yet in a position to fight them. Only these divided and weak forces can bring back to public debate the values on the basis of which we want to live. And this is how these clear lines are going to be redefined. There's a right to life and to freedom of speech and freedom of belief. This is really a front line that has to be present in our societies, just as in French society. And I will stop here.
Merci beaucoup, Basma. J'allais vous soumettre.
Thank you very much, Basma. I was going to give you an extract from the speech of the President this morning. Radical Islam fed on all unsolved conflicts. He also sees that these transitions will take time. This is when we'll have to make choices, either leave time to time or decide that we have time in our hands. This is what the President of the Republic said this morning. Very briefly, Gilles, I think you wanted to strengthen studies of Arabic so that people could understand situations, and so that we can bridge gaps. So what do you think about what the President said this morning? What can we do?
Ces propos sont très sensés.
So I think this is very logical, and this is how I designed the report I will hand in to the Prime Minister next week. It is a proposal from someone who is an academic and who is suggesting to put universities back at the core of public debate. This is a major challenge. And I would like to come back to what Basma was saying and congratulate her on this when she underlined this fact we tend to forget, which is that radical Islam, at least in the past 4 decades, was free to occupy education, charities, because for authoritarian regimes it was an opportunity to find legitimacy. They could not go into politics, so they went into education. In the short term, the result didn't seem really dangerous because they could not be elected or anything. But they conquered the mind, what I would call réseau fikri, to use their own language, but in a reverse way. Unfortunately, we see this in a lot of popular areas here, and the reactions coming from school teachers is that there has been a cultural conquest, even in France, not everywhere, of course, but we have to be aware of it, with this kind of movement. In the face of this, culture, university, and knowledge were left behind. And of course, I believe it to be a major challenge for the Democrats of the Arab world, the Muslim world, to get back into culture. Of course, the law, the fatwa forbids this. The accusation of blasphemy and so on is very important because they're supposed not to be able to talk about it. It is, however, also a major challenge here. And there is a direct correlation between the two, as Basma said before. So I think this awareness is very important, and these days, in the current situation, at a time when the President of the Republic, who is also the Chief of the Army, who guarantees the security of French citizens, is taking time to come give this speech when he's already very busy, it is very important. And it requires replies on the part of those who are being called to act. Of course, university is independent, but it still has to play a central role in the public debate. to organize this debate. And when you have a knowledge of what is happening, when you've studied these phenomena for years, you can, of course, step back and say that you don't want to be involved, that you'd rather not be noticed. But I think this is cowardice. So, of course, you have to leave time to time. But I think we have to act urgently, which doesn't mean that we do not have to think. We have to base our action on reflection. This is the role of universities, it is the role of research, it is the role of institutions such as the Institute of the Arab World, both on this side of the Mediterranean and on the other side. And I can only agree with what Basma has been saying.
Gilles, vous avez parlé de notamment
d'éducation, you told us about education, about higher education, about culture. Basma, you're in favor of strengthening, of a support of Democrats to help them set up institutions, set up networks. You were calling on the private sector and entrepreneurs whose future, or the future of their companies also depends on this. It's all in their interest to have the rule of law in their countries, and this allows me to announce the two main themes for this afternoon's debates, because we'll talk about entrepreneurship and education, which are two major challenges for young people in the Arab world, intellectually, but also economically speaking, in terms of jobs and opportunities and hope for the future. That's it. Thank you, and we'll meet again at 2 p.m.